Hi, thanks for coming. We're going to get started. My name is Jenny Breckus. I'm the director of the northern section of the Nevada chapter of the American Planning Association. We're a professional organization representing planners who work in the public and private sector. And on behalf of that organization and CEDIC Nevada, which is a citizen-based Reno group, we're welcoming you to the first of our 5 lectures for the Truckee Meadows Livable Communities Lecture Series, which is brought to the community by the funding of the John Ben Snow Memorial Trust. Our first speaker is Robert Wassmer. He is a professor of public policy and economics at Cal State Sacramento. He's been there for 10 years. Prior to that, he's taught at Wayne State in Detroit. He received his PhD in economics from Michigan State. His areas of research, interest, and publication are urban economic development, state and local finance, and K-12 education. Not purely staying in the academic realm, he's written a number of pieces that have been published in the Sacramento Bee opinion section on fiscalization of land use, social equity in the Sacramento region, and forecasting Sacramento's future growth. He's the author of 2 books, one on economic development incentives, the other on a textbook of readings in economics. We got the idea to invite Rob down when we heard him on NPR several years ago talking about revenue sharing, a proposal for revenue sharing in the Sacramento area. With that, I'll leave it to bring Rob on stage. I'd like to tell you our format. He'll talk for about 45 minutes, then we'll conclude. I'll come back up to the stage, make a push for our speaker next week, and then we'll conclude with about 10 minutes or so of Q&A. We're trying to end these promptly at 6 p.m. And Rob?
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I'll talk from down here as opposed to up there, so I think I can project. If anybody can't hear me, let me know. I'm used to doing this, teaching classes and such. It's a pleasure to be here, as I said. My family has a place up in Tahoma, so I guess I consider myself an extended member of the Truckee Meadow and get down here quite often over into Reno. As I said, I teach out in California State, Sacramento. Been out there for 10 years. Previously, I taught in Detroit, Wayne State University. When I was back then, my interest was more in studying economic development and trying to encourage growth. Right? In Sacramento, we're trying to think about perhaps not discouraging growth, but using that old that moniker of smart growth, right? Doing it in the best way. So once I've come out here, I've gotten more interested in some of the topics that are talked about in California and Nevada about growth and how best to deal with it, the fiscalization of land use, especially in California where we have this local sales tax reliance, and talking about that as a generator, area of sprawl. Some of you may have heard about Assemblyman Darrell Steinberg, a pretty progressive assembly member representing Sacramento, had some proposals for some revenue sharing in the region, sharing the sales tax revenue as a way to try to encourage smart growth and discourage sprawl. I was actively involved in helping some of that, so Jenny mentioned appeared on National Public Radio. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that I've done recently about trying to understand sprawl and what causes it, but keep it very general, and I always try to focus it on Nevada and the Reno area and Northern California, giving you some comparisons to Sacramento. So that there will be some figures and some data, but I'm going to refer you to my research at my website, and Jenny actually has some copies of the papers if you want to get them that way. So to run you through what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk a little bit about this whole concept of what is sprawl. It's a term that's thrown around. The public uses it quite a bit, but even I find myself stammering for words a bit when somebody asks me to give the 2 or 3 sentence definition of what sprawl is, especially what it is. How do you recognize it? How do you measure it? And I'm a quantitative economist. I don't work a lot in theory. I work in data. Somebody once said, "Show me the money." I always say, "Show me the numbers. Show me the data. Just don't tell me stories. I want to see the numbers and try to figure out what's going on." So I'm going to talk a little bit about how people think about sprawl, but then I'm going to settle on a quantitative definition, a number-based definition that I can show you some information on. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think and what economists think and what planners think causes this form of sprawl that I'm ultimately going to settle upon. Then I'm not going to show you the actual statistical analysis, but give you some of the evidence from the statistical analysis, looking at these different causes of sprawl and what are the relative contributions that each one of them made in these United States urban areas. Look a little bit at how Reno, Carson City, Las Vegas, which by the way are the only 3 urbanized areas, official urbanized areas in Nevada, compares to Sacramento. And then finally talk a little bit about some public policies. If we really want to do something about sprawl, as I've defined it, what can we do and how effective would it likely be? And then of course leave some room for some questions at the end. Okay? So, first thing, thinking about what is sprawl. I imagine a lot of you are planners or work with planners or have read the literature about how planners, it really is a concept that came out of the planning literature. It's not something that was developed by economists or political scientists or academics or geographers. It really was more of a qualitative type of thing, recognizing development, and some cynical approaches, anything that a planner doesn't like, or I've actually heard it described, anything that isn't planned, right? Any unplanned development is sprawl, right? It's kind of a self-serving, we need planning or else this is what we're going to get. But it's always been kind of described in the planning literature more on a qualitative sense of things, hard to measure. Low density is something that comes out, that's talked about, but you query a planner a little bit and it's not just low density. Right? For instance, LA, right? A lot of planners, a lot of people point to LA as, a poster child for sprawl. This is sprawl, this is what we see it. But LA is one of the most dense urban areas in the entire country when you just look at the number of people per square mile. So it's got to be something more than just density, right? But that obviously is an element of it. Dispersed development is always a concern, where you have land, open areas of land. I've heard a definition when people have to drive past open space to get to work, right? Or drive past open space to get to shop. That's another way of thinking about sprawl. But at the same time, we talk about we need green belts, right? We need open spaces between where we live and work and separating communities. So it's not always consistent in some of these things. Again, home separated from where you work or shop. This is the whole smart growth movement, the Urban Land Institute. And the group of progressive developers that formed it started in the early 90s. I did some work for the Urban Land Institute. Their president a couple years ago always gets to commission a project that they may be interested in studying. And the president was interested in looking at the benefit side of growth. He felt that too much smart growth has been talked about, the cost of growth and how do we mitigate the cost. But really a smart growth approach is, we want growth, where the benefits outweigh the cost. So myself and a planner, academic planner down at UC Irvine wrote a piece for the Urban Land Institute, still up at their website about the benefits of growth. How growth can do good things. And it's not always just containing growth or slowing growth down. Smart growth is looking at the benefits of growth and trying to mitigate the cost. Functional open space, loss of open space at the urban fringe, are some of the conditions that people look at for urban sprawl. A loss of a sense of community, right? Getting in more to some of the less tangible type of things, but people don't, people can't tell when they leave their community and enter another one. This is probably one of the major critiques about the LA basin, right? You can drive for 90 miles, in any direction with your eyes closed, right? Or in the back seat, I hope somebody else driving, open your eyes, and you can't really tell that you're in another part of the LA basin, right? This homogeneity of development, strip mall development, etc. Now we've gotten to some of these social equity issues about sprawl. Because often when an area sprawls, the people that are moving out to the urban fringes are the more well-to-do, right? And the people that are left behind are the less well-to-do, the poor, the single-parent families. Unfortunately, in this country, racial and ethnic minorities, right? So these social equity issues that have been, about why we need to have more compact development and get income mixing in communities. And then finally, concern about congestion. Pointing that congestion is not a cause of sprawl, but a result of sprawl. Air pollution, also. A bit of a problem there, though. If you have a lot of compact development pushing people into high rises, or into mixed-use communities, if they don't give up their automobiles, it's never been really clear to me that there would be less congestion, right? If you have a 50-story building, with 10,000 families living in it, or not maybe that much, 1,000 families living in it, right? And they all need to get to work, and it's only a mile or two away, but they all want to use an automobile. There'd be huge traffic jams, right? It's more the idea that you need to get them out of their automobiles And that's more likely to happen when you have this compact development. Economists have kind of approached this, and economists have this tradition of urban economics, right, that began in the 40s and the 50s when this country was urbanizing, and a field of economics arose that would just studied urban issues. So they've been thinking about urbanization, suburbanization. They've had papers on excess commuting, why people drive so far. But there's been some reinterpretation now looking at the planning concerns about it, and some economists going back and applying some of their language on it. An economist would think about more that sprawl probably is best thought about as excessive suburbanization, right? There's too much suburbanization going on, right? And not from some qualitative value judgment, but trying to quantify it in a typical economic way. Economists always think incremental. Do we buy something? We buy something if the benefits outweigh the cost. But one way to think about suburbanization, if there's going to be a suburbanization of some sort, right? There's going to be a new development on the outskirts. Let's think about does the benefits of that development outweigh the cost? And what public economists will point out is that the costs are greater than just the land cost and the cost of the individuals who purchase the buildings that go on there, right? There are these things called externalities, right, that people don't always think about. If you make a choice, you may have been a couple that lived in downtown Reno, had no children, worked in office buildings or casinos downtown. It was, a good choice to live down here. Then, you start being concerned about when you have children, perhaps about the crime rate, perhaps about the quality of the public schools, in the inner city area, and you make a choice, based upon your own benefits of cost to move out to a suburban area, right? And, that choice doesn't always think about some of the congestion that you're going to cause on the freeways or the additional air pollution that you're going to generate from moving back and forth, or actually the problems that you're going to leave your inner city public school worse off, right? Because you were an involved parent, right? They went to the PTA meetings, right? Kept those teachers on their toes. People like you leave, right? The school's going to be worse off. So those are some of the ideas about the social cost, right? It's a nice idea in theory and concept. It's kind of hard to get a bit of a handle on. But if you had to push me in regard to thinking about it, it's not as easy to explain to people too. But I think in some sense, a lot of what planners are talking about, in their mind, this type of development, the social costs of that development are greater than the social benefits, right? There's a need for planning, a need to try to correct it. So, economists and planners are not all that far off, just approaching it in different ways. One more theoretical, quantitative, and one more qualitative. And then, there is a need for planning or a need for government to try to slow down some of this suburbanization if these social costs are larger than the total benefits that are generated. So that's a little bit of a background about, and I'm an economist by admission, and I've only come to this planning literature, in the last 5 or 6 years, and again, just my take on reading it. There was a piece by George Gulster and a few others that appeared in Housing Policy Debate. It's the journal that the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development put out, and did a kind of what I did, surveyed a lot of the planning literature, the stuff that's been written about sprawl. And they came out with this definition of it. And it's a definition that can be quantified. So I recommend you to take a look at this article if any of you are grappling with the same type of things, about thinking about what sprawl is and how to quantify it. But with their reading of the literature is it's low levels of some combinations of 8 distinct dimensions, right? A low level of density, which we've already talked about, right? A low level of continuity, right? All these things are things that you can measure. Right? If you had the right data, a low level of concentration of economic activities in central places, clustering, a low level of clustering, a low level of centrality, that there's one central location, nuclearity, mixed uses, right? That's part of the smart growth mantra, that we need mixed use communities that just aren't all residential or all retail or highly industrial, and proximity, right? People are close to where they need to be. So, that's another way of of thinking about it. And they actually go through using these measures, I think looking at about 25 different metropolitan areas in the country and rate them on all these different measures where they had data at. And come up with a measure of how sprawled one area is to another. So I really think it is a multi-measure of what sprawl is, a multi-definitional measure. I'm only going to be using one measure here. So I wanted to lay that out right away. So people could be critical of it. But I think it works pretty well, and it works well because I'm going to be able to compare 452 different urban areas in the United States where data is going to be available from the U.S. Census. And that's what I'm going to use to talk about, levels of sprawl and then what causes differences in these levels in sprawl. So I'll be glad to talk to you when I get done, about ways you think I may alter this, or if you have any disagreements about what I've done. So here's where I'm going to lay it out, what I think about sprawl. An urban area, a U.S. urban area, is experiencing greater sprawl if it takes up a greater land area for a given population. It's really going back to the density type of measure, right? Population density. Lower population density. I'm going to use data from the U.S. Census for urbanized areas. Right? This data is put together every 10 years, and it's created by demographers, and they use a lot of GIS mapping now. In fact, they've gone to GSI mapping in 2000. In the previous decades, they did it in 1990, 1980, 1970. They didn't use GIS mapping, and they had demographers and geographers just kind of sitting down and making decisions, which were all that consistent. Now they've gone to GIS mapping and electronic ways of doing it. Unfortunately, though, you can't compare 2,000 urbanized areas to the previous ones because they're using different definitions and different techniques of getting at it. I would have loved to have been able to, that's really the question, how does an urbanized area change? In fact, some people have talked about that. You look at the increase in population and the increase in land area over a given time, right? The percentage increase in both. If the percentage increase in land area is greater than the percentage increase in population, the area has become more sprawled. So I'm only going to be able to use 2000 census data. And the long-term agenda is to look at as much as I can 2010, 2020 when that comes out. So an urbanized area begins with a central place. This is different than a metropolitan area. Metropolitan areas aren't really good for this, although some people do use it, because metropolitan areas are always county-based. The Reno metropolitan area is only the Reno, what's the county that Reno's in? Washoe County, right? That's the Reno metropolitan area. By definition, they're county-based. In Sacramento, it's Sacramento County, El Dorado County, and Placer County, right? That means it extends all the way up to the western shore of Lake Tahoe. That doesn't make much sense as far as an urban location. Urban means that people live and commute and shop. Most people living on the west shore of Lake Tahoe don't drive into Sacramento, which is a central place, right? The urbanized area, consists of central places. For instance, in Reno, there are two central places. Reno and Carson City. There is, demographers at the census look at these places and say, these are places that are, integrated in some sense in that they have a lot of people commuting to them. They're a workplace. There's retail activity going on there. There's residential activity. And it's different than the census metropolitan area, which only has one central place, right? This has multiple central places. So I like this use also because now, what most urban economists and planners talk about, we're not after monocentricity anymore, right? We don't want everybody to live in one place, or to work at one place or expect that people do that. We're living in this world of edge cities, of polycentricity, where there's multiple central places, and we need to encourage that, right? There's nothing wrong with Carson City becoming its own employment and housing and resident and retail center, and Reno being one. And the ideal is, smart growth is to have some green space between the two, right? Those are the type of communities that we're talking about. So we take these central places and then we build them out, to find out the size of an urbanized area. As long as a census block has 1,000 people per square mile in it, right? Then it's considered part of the urbanized area. So you just keep going farther and farther out until it becomes less than 1,000 people per square mile. Then it's not part of the urbanized area. Las Vegas, has 3 different cities that are central places. Las Vegas itself, Henderson, North Las Vegas. This is also nice because it uses central designated places. The census will only use a jurisdiction, the metropolitan area will only use a jurisdiction. This is a census designated place. So in places like California and Nevada where it's difficult for places to incorporate, you can just use census-designated places, which are non-incorporated places, but are still these locuses of economic and residential and retail activity. Okay? Carson City only has one central place, which is Carson City. So that's what I'm going to be using is these urbanized areas. And thinking about what I'm going to try to explain is why is one urbanized area so much bigger than another urbanized area for the same number of people living in it, right? And the idea is if it's bigger, most Americans I think would think of that as sprawl. It's put a bigger urban footprint on the land for the same number of people. It's not as compact, right? It's not as densely populated. I also want to look some more in the future about the percentage of people living in central places. I think that's another good way of thinking about sprawl. If you have more people living in the area's central places, that's some measure of smart growth, and opposite of the sprawl. So let me, here's a map, and it doesn't reproduce all that well. It comes off the census website of the Reno urbanized area. Oh, now I can use my pointer, right? Right there is, the central business district of Reno, and there is Sparks, right next to it. So the urbanized area, is designated by this dark line, right? And those of you who know the local geography better can see, what it consists of. And it can also extend along roads for a while that doesn't have 1,000 population density to reach another area, right? So it looks a lot nicer when you blow it up on, on your complete screen. But this is what I'm looking at. This is the Reno urbanized area. 452 of these exist in the United States in the year 2000. Why are some larger than others for the same amount of population? I think this is an informative diagram, which is about as most technical as I'll get here. But I think it shows you exactly what I'm trying to get at. Along here I have population, right? Along here I have square miles, right? So up here is New York, Newark, New Jersey, Connecticut, urbanized area, right? That's the most populated, and it has the most square miles, right? Over here's Los Angeles right here. Here's Dallas, Fort Worth. Here's Chicago, right? These are all the big populated urbanized areas. You move down here. Here's Galveston, Texas. Here's Davis, California, right, butting up right up against Sacramento. Here's Vallejo, California. Sacramento, California falls right there. Salinas, California. Interesting, you see a lot of Californias down here. What this map is called the regression analysis. What it shows is what happens when, and population and square miles are measured in logs. Just because it's a nonlinear relationship between population, if I didn't draw it, if I didn't graph it in logs, it would curve down, right? And you wouldn't get that nice straight line. But when you put it in logs, it shows that when population goes up by a certain percentage, you have a pretty consistent relationship that square miles are going up, right? And in fact, the regression shows that you can explain 80% of the variation. You can do a pretty good job of explaining how big an urbanized area is just by how many people live there. But what you can also see is, here's Atlanta, Georgia, that little dot right there, right? Atlanta, Georgia has about the same population as, Salinas, California, or Miami, Florida, or Dallas, Fort Worth. But, if we were using population to predict how big Atlanta should be, it would be along this line that runs through the middle, right? But Atlanta is what statisticians call an outlier, right? It's way off how big it should be for the given amount of population. And these ones below this, this is a 90% confidence interval, are outliers in the other direction. Something's going on differently there. They're smaller than what you would predict for the given U.S. urbanized area. So that was my research. I know population does a pretty good job of explaining how big they are, but what are the factors that cause them to be so different, right? For Atlanta to be way off, taking up so much more square miles than another place, right? And California has taken some these popular criticism for being sprawled, but when you look at it, the California urbanized areas fall below on the lower edges of line, right? They're actually taking up less land for the same amount of population. And you can think about there's obvious reasons why, right? Land use regulation, topography, are issues there. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I produced this for something else, and I didn't have the resources to put Reno up there, so I don't really know where Reno is. I'm going to give you some other information about Reno in a minute. But that kind of shows the basis of what my research is trying to do, find out why there's some differences like that. Here's some thoughts, some of it coming out of the planning literature, some of it coming out of the economic literature, about what causes these differences, about why some places take up so much more land than other places. One that economists, again, like I said, have been talking about for a long time is something called natural evolution. As people become richer, you can relate it to your own experiences, economists, housing and land are normal goods, right? As we become richer, we want to buy more of them, right? And more, we want to buy more square footage, or we want to live in more square footage. It becomes more expensive to buy that square footage in a central place like a downtown. You could conceivably buy it, right? So you trade off and you go out to the suburbs and buy it, and you trade off a longer commute if you work downtown. There's always been this push-pull relationship with even people who work downtown. So income is a natural. So you'd expect places that are richer, right, that have a higher median income to be more sprawled. Because people want bigger homes, they want bigger lots. So that's a theoretical prediction. Family structure is important. If people are married, if they have children, right, they want bigger lots. Auto ownership has also been talked about, and you're going to see in my research that's the most important explanatory factor. The more people own automobiles, the easier it is to go out to those far distances and separate themselves from where they work and where they shop. Age structure, young and old, would also have some impact. And then differences in the non-residential uses. Is the industry primarily wholesale and warehousing, that needs a central location? Then you expect the whole metropolitan area to be more centralized. Is it more management and finance, where people want to work in central business districts and high-rises? Then you'd expect it to be more central. So, those are just some of the natural factors. It's not any evil conspiracy of government or developers. It's just what people want, right? It's consumer sovereignty. People want this. Some planners have talked about, that there is some tastes that have been changed, right? That we can just educate people a bit. But I'm just taking those as given based upon this. Another thing that's come out that planners have talked about and economists have recognized is flight from blight. People will move farther out. The example I gave about living in Reno, right? If the schools are poor in the central city, if the crime rate is high, right? There's another reason to leave besides these natural reasons. It's fleeing blight. Blight has been talked about before about building blight. But we're talking here about more socioeconomic blight. Poverty, crime, housing type, that's another thing. If there's a lot of pre-World War II small homes in the central place that people want something different. Again, race and ethnicity could be a possible signal that people look at. Central places that are higher African American or higher Latino, higher Asian, maybe a blight that people are looking at and wanting to move away from. Again, these are all theories that I'm going to test using some of the actual data. Fiscalization of land use is something that I've talked about. Some talk about, the more the jurisdictions, the more they compete with each other, the more they draw businesses out from the central places and sprawl out. Variation in local revenue reliance. The sales tax story is the one that's told in California. California jurisdictions get to keep 1% of all retail sales. There's only a certain number of autos that can be sold in the Sacramento region. The outlying cities, the unincorporated places of the county want these auto malls because it brings in this discretionary revenue, right? You sell a $30,000 automobile, you get $300, and you don't have to provide much services for the person driving out, right? Well, they're clamoring after these auto malls, putting the land deals together, and where those auto malls used to be in the 50s and 60s are the historical, central place locations, and they're moving out. That can be a generator of sprawl also. Property tax reliance can also be a story told about sprawl that, in most places in the country, property taxes are what's used to fund local governments. So if there's more property tax reliance, it's easier to create new communities out on the edge and then sprawl and make it attractive for people to move out to those. Growth management is an issue, right, that planners talk about. This is really direct intervention. What is this? 8 states have adopted statewide growth management laws. Where the state legislature has said, we have a problem here. We want to pursue a smart growth agenda. We're going to write statewide planning that pushes more compact urban development, and we're going to require local plans to comply with this, right? People have looked at this. Other states have it, but people think that these are the ones that really are the ones that are the most rigorous in doing something. So I do some testing on that. And then local growth boundary regulations. Not statewide, but a locality decides. The Sacramento County has an urban service boundary. That if you go outside of the service boundary, they're not going to provide you city or county services in that area, as a way for more compact. The Portland urban growth boundary, right, just talked about. So I control for those factors too. So those are basically the factors that I'm going to be looking at that causes differences in the size of these areas. Without going through all the details, again, I use regression analysis, statistically seeing the impact of all these. I thought this would be an interesting way to tell the story to this audience. The Reno urbanized area is 118.6 square miles, that map I showed you. This is what my statistics show, that if a factor rises by 10%. So if Reno's population grows by 10%, say in the next 10 years, this, what's going on in the rest of the United States would predict that it would grow by 10.6 square miles. Right? That's the impact of population. If its household income goes up by 10%, median household income, it's going to go up by 3.2 square miles. So I think this is helpful to show you the relative impact of different factors. If percentage households owning 1 or more cars goes up by 10%. These numbers, I'll show you the numbers in a minute, but they're up around 90%, right? 90% of households own 1 or more cars. So if that goes up by 10%, right, then that goes up, pretty much up to 100%, right? A 90%, a 10% increase is a 9% more increase. So, it's going to go up by, what is that? I have to look here, I can't see. 39.2 square miles, right? That's the biggest bang right there, automobile ownership. If more people own cars, the area is going to sprawl more. I'll come back to it in some of my policy suggestions. Percentage population born in the state. More people born in the state, it's going to become smaller. There is some sense of community. If people were born in the state, they're more attached to central places, they're less likely to move out to the fringe. It's really just a control group, nothing that we really can do, but it just kind of explains differences across areas. Areas with a lot of new in-migration from out of the state. With a percentage population less than 18 years old, if that goes up, more children, it goes up by 5.8 square miles. Right? Older people, the greater percentage of older people, the Del Webbs and the Sun Cities out on the edge, right? It becomes more sprawled. And here's some measures of industry. If there's more employed in wholesale or transportation warehousing, it becomes smaller. More employed in management finance, it becomes smaller. Right? So those are some of the natural evolution factors, but you can see that population and owning 1 or more cars, right, are big drivers here of what causes areas to be larger and smaller in size. Flight from blight, right? These are some factors where perhaps we could have explicit policies, to reduce the amount of poverty in our central places, in Reno and Sparks, right? If that would go down by 10%, the area would shrink by 1.9 square miles, right? So you see, it's a driver, but it's not as big of a driver as the population and auto ownership. Crime rate, about half that, 0.8 square miles. Interesting, I just put these race and ethnicities in there. If a greater percentage Asian, it's actually smaller, right? That doesn't drive people out, looking at the percentage Asian. The only one that I could pick up across the entire United States is African American. If the central places have a greater percentage of the population African American, a 10% increase in that would, again, these are all hypothetical for Reno, would drive it up by a half square mile. But it's a small impact compared to some of the other ones. Latino, the same thing, a negative, right? Opposite of African American, more like Asian. Going on to some of the other ones, the number of counties in the urbanized area, I couldn't find any impact from the number of central places, but the number of counties raises an urbanized area by 1.1 square miles, right? Part of this competition, right? Driving more competition among communities, offering incentives, sprawling an area out for that reason. Percentage state's local revenue from property taxes, if that would go up by, this is a statewide measure, right? As a measure of what local governments are doing, 1.2 square miles. General sales taxes, 0.8 square miles. Here I find that the property taxation has a greater effect than that, but finding evidence of this. You know, and a lot of this stuff has never been done before. People have talked about this, but there isn't a lot of this, you know, explicit evidence, statistical evidence to prove it. You know, there's some regional dummies here. Reno is actually in the area that I didn't include, but if Reno was hypothetically put in a different area, like if all of a sudden Reno was moved to New England, right, it would actually be 2.4 square miles bigger, right? There are institutional and historical factors that New England areas are sprawled more than Western areas. This is interesting. I have a measure of the wet sun belt and the dry sun belt. The wet sun belt are basically the southeastern cities, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. The story goes is that they have water out on the fringe that you can tap into with wells, right? It makes it a lot easier to build a home out there. The dry sun belt are the Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, right? They're actually, I'm sorry, Nevada is not in the dry sun belt. Nevada is part of the western region, which I've left out. But it's Arizona, New Mexico, and where else? Texas. You know, they are actually smaller, right? Because they need to rely on city water, city-provided water. Some interesting findings about growth management, which I think it has some real interesting policy. And in my reading of the literature, this stuff hasn't been put up all that much. The years that the state had a vertically integrated growth management program. Vertically integrated means that the state sets some smart growth, some slow growth, some compact requirements, land use planning, and requires all the local governments below it to adopt it. Washington, Oregon, Florida are places that have adopted these. For every 10% increase in the number of years that's in place, the area shrinks by 2.6 square miles. So having some real impacts. That's every 10, you know, so cumulative as it goes on more and more, right, you get these impacts. For horizontal, that means that a county and a city, horizontal means at the same level, I'm sorry. So cities that butt up against each other, their growth plans have to be consistent. Not all state growth management plans require that, but if it's in there, that also shrinks it by 1.4 square miles. If you have what's called integrated growth management, which means only that the state requires that the cities, every land use decision that's made by the city must fit into the city's general plan. That's called internally integrated. That actually has a positive effect. It doesn't do anything. You know, there's nothing that's been imposed from above, right? It's just that the city has to follow its own plan, and that plan may be, you know, not smart or compact in any sense. I used some different measures of urban containment that a planning researcher named Chris Nelson has developed. The only one that I found had an impact was a strong restrictive urban containment measure, which is like Portland's, an urban growth boundary that actually tries to shrink the amount of development. You know, it has an impact of about negative 1.2 square miles for every year that it's been in existence. Every 10% increase in the years that it's been in existence. Here's some numbers. How am I doing on time? A couple more slides and I'm done. Here's some numbers that look at how these different areas compare. The sign in red shows the effect that it should have. So population should have a positive effect. You know, here's the actual square miles in these different areas. Reno's in blue. You can see the income differences. So you know, this is some of the ideas of why Reno is bigger or smaller is because of these underlying factors, right? The only place that had any type of growth management of these 4 areas was Sacramento, that had an urban growth boundary of 7 years. But the Sacramento's wasn't found to have an impact because it wasn't a strong restrictive one. But you can see some differences in sales taxes, right? California has this local component of its sales tax, a greater reliance. There's more sprawl in California because of this. California, even after Proposition 13, its local governments rely more on property taxes than Nevada governments. That also indicates further sprawl. More counties in the Sacramento urbanized area. Reno and Las Vegas having higher percentage Latino, but that was actually shown to reduce sprawl, right? To reduce the size of the urbanized area. Some of the crime rate is interesting, right? Sacramento is actually higher. These are crime rates, FBI uniform crime rates per 100 people in a given year. But Las Vegas and Carson City are lower. Central place poverty, there's some reasons why Reno is bigger. These are, percentage in management and finance, percentage in wholesale and retail, age distribution. Look at here, Sacramento has 67% of the people that were born in the state, right? Probably not true for all of California, but Reno has a lot smaller percentage of people living here, newcomers who were not born in the state. So it's a pretty decent model in explaining why some areas take up more space than other areas. But when you think about what could public policy do, well, here's some policy prescriptions that come out of this. Obviously and planners have been talking about this for a long time, right? Transit-oriented development, transit corridors, getting people out of automobiles. A 1% reduction in the percentage of people owning cars results in a 3.3% reduction in the urbanized area square miles. It's what economists call an elastic response, right? You get a bigger percentage response, on that upside when you reduce it. Central place poverty, right? You can see that gives you a 1% reduction in that only gives you a 0.16% reduction in square miles. A lot smaller response, right? If we're going to attack sprawl, by reducing central place poverty, if we could even, have that as a statewide or federal policy. Central place crime, even a smaller amount, right? Only 0.07. The statewide growth management programs, these numbers, are for a 1% increase in the years in place, but they're cumulative, right? They keep adding up as more years add in. So, these things look to be the more stronger ways that we can look at. If we really want to get serious about reducing sprawl as measured this, making Reno look more like Orem, Utah, Provo, Orem, Utah, right? Or making, Greenville, North Carolina look more like Reno, these growth management programs are the way to go. No accounting for, the cost that they would impose and the political capital that's necessary to try to get some of that stuff through. But I think that's an important thing that comes out of this research. Pretty much 10 more minutes and we can still get out of here in time. So thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. I have a website if you want to copy that down, or you can just, search a Google search with CSUS and Wassmer, and you'll come to my website. And I have explicit papers that talk about it. There's really 2 or 3 different papers. With that, I'll close. Thank you.
Any questions? I have one. Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting that children raise sprawl. That corresponds to what people say. People like to say, how many of you walked to school when you were a kid? And everyone raises their hand. And how many people let their kids walk to school now? And no one's kids walks to school now. And I think it's like a 70% reduction since 1970. And so having, I guess it's more, if the population becomes younger, you have more sprawl. Is it because we're driving kids around all the time now? Is it?
Well, I think, yeah, the typical MO is that you drive your kid to school, so, it doesn't really benefit to live in a compact community where they can walk, because you drive them anyway.
So kids
right?
are a sprawl inducer, I guess.
Yeah, and
driving inducer.
I think people become more concerned about the blight, in their neighborhood, They don't want to live in a central place because it's crime. Why don't people drive their kids to school? Because they're afraid of them being abducted, right? Even if it's only, a half a mile or a quarter mile. So, that plays into the crime rate, which I showed, right? A higher central place crime rate also causes people to leave. So it's just not one of these things, it's a multitude of these things, that induce you to, move out to some place and endure a half an hour commute or, because of children, because of worry about crime, schools, public schools not being as strong.
Oh, okay.
So I think it's a multitude of all those things. And older people also, right? They're going to be more concerned about crime also. And you see an area where there's a greater percentage of people over 65 is actually more sprawled than one that's less. You tell stories otherwise that older people like to live in compact senior citizen developments, but I mean the data just shows that an area that has more older people, is going to be more sprawled.
Eric?
I seem to remember some research on school building and sprawl, and I remember in the Santa Clara Valley in the 1950s, there was a law that passed that allowed school districts not to be coterminous with municipal boundaries, which allowed this San Jose to grow enormously because you could have 13 different school districts within the annexed areas of San Jose, and everyone could retain their local, could go to their local school district but not have to participate in it. I don't know if that's a fact.
Yeah, I really, that could be another variable that you could put in there, whether the state requires school districts to be coterminous, with city boundaries. What I think picks that up is, I think that's a very good point, and economists have talked about it, that a lot of people like to move out to the suburbs is because they can move into their own little fiefdom of people just like them. Economists and political scientists call it the taboo effect, voting with one's feet. You can move out there and you don't have this problem where there's a whole bunch of higher income, lower income, middle income people, income redistribution, different demands on services. You move out to this little community, you form your own city or your own school district, and you can tax yourself. That's why property taxation also generates more sprawl. Then that becomes attractive for more people to follow, right? And you're right, that story about school districts would be the same thing, where you can create, because if you move out and you're still in the LA Unified School District, right, or the Reno Unified School District, it's not as attractive as you could go out and form your own school district out there.
In your public policy slide, the last one, I was hoping to see something about fiscalization of growth. Have you looked at all at controlling for different tax models, state by state, county by county? Yeah,
well, I didn't mention that there because I don't think that that's very likely. These were things that I thought we could actually adopt policies to try to slow down sprawl. And I don't think we're going to change the entire local revenue structure as a way of reducing sprawl. But there was evidence there, yeah, that if California, especially its local component, right? It's the local component of the sales tax that drives sprawl. And that's what I'm measuring. I'm only measuring the percentage of local own source revenue from sales taxes. So when that goes up, there's more sprawl. Because there's that inducement, to pull the retail center or the regional mall out there, create this type of fiefdom that we talked about, that's attractive for people to live in, and generate sprawl. The old story is that communities were formed because people moved out to an area, and then you got enough people out there to create a city. In California, it's the other way around, right? First, you need to bring the retail out to a place, and then you can buy off the county through the LAFCO, right? Because you have to make it revenue neutral, right? So I think that really is the case. But as I was talking about Darrell Steinberg, he talked about sales tax revenue sharing within the region, and that went absolutely nowhere, right? Because there was going to be winners and there was going to be losers in the short term, right? And almost every city, even central places, have hired city managers who come in and say, I know how to play this fiscalization of land use, right? We'll win this game. We can get those auto malls back. Pay me $180,000, and I can get you winning on this fiscalization of land use. California allows local governments to cooperate, to share sales tax revenue. There's only like 2 or 3 in the entire state that's ever done it in the 7 years that it's been put in place. So I think your point is well taken, but I don't see that as a policy. it probably is along the same lines of reducing central place poverty, right? That we're not going to, that's a huge program in itself. It's not going to have that big of a payoff in Sprawl. It's really auto use is what, if you really want to do it, is going to reduce the size, the footprint of these areas.
I was really surprised to see that the warehouse industrial did play a huge role in how, wasn't a big factor in producing sprawl. And I mean, when I think of low density, high impact on, high impact footprint, I couldn't think of anything more than, well, we have, huge warehouses here in Reno. So why do you think that doesn't have big impact?
Well, it has an elastic response for every percentage increase in the population that's employed in these three industries: wholesale, transportation, warehousing. I picked them because they're industries that require a central node, right? That things are shipped out of there. So, if it goes up by 1%, if Reno would become, its employment there would go up by 1%, holding everything else constant, its square miles would go down by 1.3%. So it is having an impact, right? You see what I'm saying? That, I'm sorry, 1.3 square miles out of a total of 118. So it's not that big of an impact. But
And that's what I was just surprised about it. But I was wondering if you could speak to that.
yeah.
Because it's reducing sprawl for a very land consumptive industry.
Counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think this is picking up more the traditional wholesale transportation and warehousing that was based in inner cities, along rail lines, along rivers, right? But now you have, you're right, now you have the stuff that's going on around here, with the Amazon.com and the Borders and all that stuff, right, where they want to be in a suburban location along an interchange, and that could also be a sprawl generator. But overall, across the entire United States, I think traditionally more of it still has historically been located at these central places, and that makes the area more compact. But you're right, there'd be a need to look at differences, what you described. That's a good point.
Sorry. What do you see on the other end of this? If there's limiting factors such as available land, being in a valley, for example,
Mm-hmm.
Do you see your sprawl factors increase and then start declining?
Well, that was that measure of the dry sunbelt areas, which are in the west. That besides just water shortages, there usually are in valleys, that bump up against mountains. So that would be a limiting factor, and that's one of the reasons why LA is so compact, right? Because it has bumped up against the mountains. It doesn't have anywhere else to go, and there is actually infill going on, quite a bit of it in LA. That is being taken up. So that's all that I'm measuring. People, I'm not picking up the sprawlness of LA besides all those other factors. I'm talking about the compactness and its density. But you're right. That's a good point. It's just hard to get those type of measures in this type of study. Obviously, more of a case study type of thing. If you had two areas that were very similar, but one was in a different type of geographic setting, you're right, that would be a limiting factor.
Out of all the cities that you've studied, cities the size of Reno, which one, in your mind, is the ideal? That has a great amount of growth, has a great amount of density? Is there a good model that Reno can learn from?
Well, I don't think I'm the best qualified to answer that. I turn that over to my planning brethren, to talk about that, because, I'm just trying to study about why Reno looks differently than other places, and there are inherent differences. In some sense, an economist would come back and say, provided we don't have these externalities, these things that people aren't paying for, Reno is an ideal size right now. What's so bad about Reno in the way it looks now? Farther out. So we need to compare that against these costs. And that's the difficult thing to do. To become this social engineer and to say that, the people left behind in the central city schools, the bad air that some people have to breathe, the congestion on freeways, those are all bad things, right? That we need to have smart growth, we need to have more compact development. But there's a lot of good things that sprawl brings along, right? There's a lot of very happy citizens who can now afford homes farther out, in these little fiefdoms where they think their children can get better schools and they can play in parks, that are bigger than what would be in central places. So it's a trade-off. How do you make those type of decisions? Do you leave it to a planner to try to think about it, or do you leave it to the political process? Right? That's really the inherent type of question. And I think Democrats and Republicans, that's our divide in this country, right? On which side we leave it to, right? Do you leave it to the market, or do we need to come in and get people to think more about the cost? And then how do you really get them to think about the cost? Do you have land? Do you have fees, for fringe development? Do you have toll roads for congestion? That you charge people for a longer commute. There's all sorts of ways of dealing with it. So,
I think we had one more question up there. Was there another question? Okay, Gretchen, and then we're...
Could you look at some of those state mandates and that was helping create those successful communities and see any common threads with the policies?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part. You see what?
See any common threads?
Oh yeah, I just didn't control whether they had a statewide growth management dummy. I controlled for the type of dummy that it was. It's the type of growth management that it was, and that's very important because like Georgia has a statewide growth management that our planners look at and say it's absolutely worthless. It doesn't do anything. It just made some people feel good to write it into legislation, right? So it's not even up there, right? People who've looked at it, planners who've looked at it said it's important to look at the horizontal integration. And that has the biggest bang. The state sets out to say, okay, we want more compact urban areas. We're going to write a statewide land use law that, pushes towards more compact urban areas, and all local governments have to comply with it, right? If you want to shrink, that's going to have the most effect. And then, to make that even stronger would be that local governments have to be horizontally integrated, right? That what you're doing has to correspond with what your neighbor is doing, right? That's called horizontal integration. Some statewide growth management programs don't have that. And then the other one is
we call it conformity here.
Conformity?
With your own plan.
With your own plan, right? Our land use decisions have to
Yeah.
go back and look at that.
Yeah.
That in of itself was not found to be something that shrinks the size of urbanized areas. And it makes sense because your own plan could not call for compact development, right? So you can forget the conformity, and there's some statewide growth management programs that just require conformity. New Jersey comes to mind. I just remember. New Jersey claims it has a statewide growth management plan, but all it requires is conformity. It's not doing anything, right? You need that more, what a land developer would call that more oppressive one, right? If the state's going to tell you how compact you are, right? And then you need to get the cities cooperating with each other. The loss of local control, right? Your plan has to correspond. Those are the buzzwords. Where it's difficult to do this. Florida has one that has all three, right? And some evidence here that it is shrinking the size of their urbanized area, given everything else that's going on there, right? That's always what economists call the ceteris paribus, holding everything else constant. You put a growth management program in. That's why I said it for Reno. If they did it hypothetically, these are the impacts you'd see. But over time they would add up, right? They're cumulative every 1% a year, so they would shrink it over time. But there's a lot of political capital for legislators to put something like that in place, especially in a Republican state. But it happened in Florida, right? When it was about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when they adopted their growth management plan. But it's been under attack ever since, right? On the verge of being repealed. You look, and now we have Prop 37 or Measure 37, right? That's the warning for this type of stuff too, right? That even makes it more difficult to do some of this stuff about the takings clause. And when you put this in place, you have to compensate private landowners, for taking over the right to develop. So, my point is that when you look at these numbers, population and ownership of cars, is driving a lot of this. What's that old Pogo cartoon? We have met the enemy, and the enemy is us, right? They published on Earth Day 20 years ago. It's the same thing, right? It's all these individual decisions that we make that is good for all of us, but when they all add up, we don't like the cumulative result, right? Of this sprawl, loss of community. But it's difficult for any one of us to change those decisions. Because it's an impact upon us. And that's what economists want to point out. There's public benefits of trying to reduce sprawl, but there's also a lot of private costs that need to be thought about. And I think if you know, if planners can more come to that realization and thinking about how to deal with that and perhaps how to compensate people, you know, when you push them towards, you know, this smart growth, we could go a little bit further. Again, I point to Measure 37 as what the ultimate result is, right? That people want to be compensated, even in a green state like Oregon, who adopted one of the state growth management programs. 67% of the people carried that in Measure 37.